Let's take an overview of the war in the East for World War II. We talked in class about how the Japanese had initial success, starting with the Pearl Harbor attack, and on that same day there were other locations also attacked by the Japanese, including the Wake Island, the island of Guam, the Philippines, Malaya, and Hong Kong. Many of these were important ports for the United States or direct territories of the United States, such as the Philippines and the island of Guam. So in doing so, the Japanese were aiming to take out as much of our ability to stop them in the future by destroying our fleet as much as possible, and to make it difficult for us to have trading locations and other locations from which to launch future attacks, such as the port of Hong Kong. So they definitely sent a statement on December 7th, 1941 that they were serious and that they were out to stop us as much as possible. They also were able to sink important British battleships, including the ones you see here, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Furthermore, later on in December of that same year, shortly after the Pearl Harbor attacks, they also captured Hong Kong and captured 12,000 prisoners. From there, they continued their growing assaults and expansion throughout the Pacific by attacking islands such as the Dutch East Indies and other places where we were forced to give up and surrender. So by mid-1942, like we had said in class, it's easy to understand why we would be a little bit discouraged and going along with the map on 157 of how big the Japanese empire was getting, and the fact that we were seriously damaged in our ability to stop their expansion and to stop their attacking of different places to continue the growth of their empire. That greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that they had started in 1940 was definitely on its way to completion, just like the Japanese had said that they wanted to do from the beginning. So with this, along with the conditions that we talked about in class with some of the videos of what it was like in some of these Pacific islands to fight the Japanese, it was very difficult for us to turn the tide of the war in the East. So in some ways, many historians feel the war in the East was a much greater challenge for us in World War II than the war in Europe with the Nazi onslaught. All of this changed in mid-1942 with the Battle of Midway, which is considered the turning point in the Pacific War. There were two serious setbacks that the Japanese faced in the middle of 1942, which resulted in our turning of the war to our being on the offensive and the Japanese being on the defensive, and them beginning to retreat rather than to advance like they had been. So these two setbacks are what you see on the screen here. First of all, the Japanese failed to capture Port Moresby, which is on the island of New Guinea. If you look on the map of on 157, that island sits directly to the north of Australia. And the reason why this was a huge setback was because if they had captured this particular port, they would have brought Australia within their very close reach of their bombers, and that could have pretty much taken Australia for the Japanese. We needed Australia to remain free of Japanese control because that would be the staging ground for our continued assaults on the Japanese from there on out. So we couldn't let Australia fall to the Japanese. And definitely the British were in on this too, because Australia from way back in the 1700s had been a British colony. So we prevented the Japanese from taking Port Moresby, and therefore they wouldn't have a place to launch their bombers from to attack Australia. And then the Battle of Midway itself, which you can see some bullet points here about what happened in that particular battle. Now, Midway is far away from New Guinea in Australia. It is basically in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. If you look again on the map on 157, it is directly to the west of Pearl Harbor. If you look on the screen again, you can see here, because actually on your map on page 157, it doesn't detail it exactly of where Midway is, but you can see here, this is Hawaii, and then Midway is right here. So literally it's almost midway between Hawaii and Japan. This is where the Japanese failed and caused them to then be on the defensive as opposed to the offensive. The reason the Japanese wanted to attack this particular island is because since its location is pretty close to Hawaii, they were hoping that they could continue to draw out U.S. naval aircraft carriers and then destroy those, the ones that they hadn't destroyed in the Pearl Harbor attack. But this did not succeed. And the major reason for this is because we had cracked their secret codes, so we knew exactly when and where they were coming, and therefore we could be ready. Now, some of the success in cracking the codes can be attributed to the Navajo code breakers. There have been some movies made about them, the famous one, the Wind Talkers, details the story of these Navajo Indians that basically used their code language for us to code messages in the Pacific. And we were also able to use some of them working along with Japanese Americans to crack the Japanese codes. So us having this type of intelligence enabled us to crack their codes and know of their plans in advance. So therefore, the Japanese were not successful in tipping the naval balance in their favor by further destroying the U.S. fleet. And because of this, we were able to continue being on the offensive from this point out, as opposed to the defensive. In this battle, not only did we beat the Japanese forces, their soldiers, but we were able to destroy a total of 4 aircraft carriers, which it was much more difficult for them to recover that, as opposed to the United States, who at this point, us being in the war full time now, like you saw in the America Story of Us documentary, our factories were in high gear again at this point from the long decade of the 1930s with the Great Depression. And we were cranking out aircraft carriers along with other types of war supplies at a very fast pace that the Japanese could not keep up with. So from this point on, the Japanese were going to be on the defensive, and we were going to be able to launch more and more aircraft carriers, planes, and other things that were necessary to finally defeat the Japanese. The historian John Keegan, who is a very famous military historian, especially on the 2 world wars, comments on the success of the Midway battle on page 157 in the middle, and it really does sum up why this Midway battle was so important in turning the tide of the war in the East. And he says, not only did the balance in the Pacific between fleet carriers now stand equal, because now we had sunk 4 of their ships, he goes on to say the advantage that the Japanese had lost could never be made good. 6 fleet carriers would join the Japanese Navy in 1942 to 44. America would launch 14, as well as 9 light carrier and 66 escort carriers, creating a fleet against which Japan could not stand. It was now to be condemned to the defensive. So this showing that us taking out 4 of their aircraft carriers and the fact that we began high-scale production of even more that the Japanese could not keep up with is why we were able to start winning rather than being defeated over and over like we had been. From this point on, the Japanese were retreating, and General Douglas MacArthur, who was the supreme commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, began a strategy of island hopping to begin recovering some of the islands lost to the Japanese in the early years of the war in the Pacific. And is exactly like what it sounds, island hopping. We were going from one location to another, working our way closer and closer to the mainland of Japan, and taking back key locations that were necessary for shipping and staging grounds along the way. Island hopping was definitely dependent on our ability to be superior in the air and at sea. So a combined Air Force, Navy, and Marines operations was required in the Pacific to take back these islands from Japanese control. Not only that, we island hopped in basically 2 different directions, and you can see here, and also on page 158 of your book, that we had Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific operating and going from island to island, while General Douglas MacArthur was operating in the Southwestern Pacific. So with the combination of these 2 men, plus forces from Great Britain and Australia, is what allowed us to work our way closer to the mainland of Japan. But it was definitely not an easy task to accomplish by any means. The fighting in the Pacific was extremely vicious, and even though we were eventually victorious and then dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, it took serious death tolls to get to that point. There were some very vicious battles fought, such as the Battle of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and these campaigns left thousands and thousands of Marines, Navy officers, and members of the Navy and the Air Force dead. The reason for this viciousness was because of the Japanese Code of Honor and the fact that they would rather commit suicide than to surrender. They did kamikaze attacks, which you can see on page 158 in the sidebar in the yellow. These involved tactics that the Germans and the Italians did not use over in Europe. And so American soldiers had to adapt mentally as well as physically to be able to take on the Japanese in a successful manner. The Japanese had dug series of tunnels inside these different island mountains that we didn't even know that they were there. And once we found out that they had huge numbers of men literally hiding inside of tunnels which they had dug out in these mountains, we had to do whatever we could to get them out. And sometimes that involved torching them out and other things that were just extremely vicious and aggressive, because the Japanese just would not fight in the same manner as soldiers from Europe. So it was definitely took a mental toll on our soldiers as well as a physical toll. But you can see on page 158 the progress that Nimitz and MacArthur took to be able to work our way closer to Japan itself. You can see that in 1943, Nimitz took Gilbert Islands and then the Marshall Islands, and then in 1944 began landing in the Marianas. These victories allowed us to open up the route to the Philippines, which had been previously attacked by Japan, and MacArthur had earlier had to leave the Philippines and promised that he would return, which he did. These different victories were important for logistics and for morale, because with each victory we were able to not only physically work our way closer to Japan, but we were also able to see that we could be successful, and even though the Japanese had fanatical resistance, to overcome that. Probably some of the biggest battles would be the ones at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and also in the Leyte Gulf, which was near the Philippines. These victories came at a very high cost, but we were able to, despite the deaths that you can see the tolls of on page 158, get to the point where we could launch the atomic bombs on Japan, which we hadn't originally planned to do. We didn't even know that the atomic bombs were in existence or would work until right before we used them. The commanders of the Navy and the Marines thought that we would have to do a land invasion of Japan, which they knew would be extremely difficult and would result in a very high death toll. President Truman knew this as well, but fortunately for us, we were able to use the atomic bomb to bring the war to a close. I would encourage you to read carefully on 158 the death tolls, not only with the soldiers fighting, but also civilians. You can see that in the Battle of Okinawa, the population dropped dramatically, and they estimate over 160,000 dying while the fighting was going on between the Japanese and the Americans. Also, equipment, ships, and planes were lost. You can see the tolls for that for the Japanese, and the fact that we lost huge amounts of prisoners and men that were fighting. So it was a very difficult campaign in the East. But fortunately, we were able to use these successes with island hopping to again regain locations that were important for logistical support. And you can see at the right above the paragraph about the atomic bomb that we were able to clear out the Japanese from Burma, which then allowed us to enter China again, which was important for our eventual success over the Japanese as well. So it was all about strategy and which islands were most important to regain from the Japanese to launch further attacks, and also to regain the ability to ship other types of supplies to our soldiers who were in desperate need of things like water and food that they had suffered severe shortages of. So it was a very different strategy in the Pacific as opposed to in Europe. Finally, the war in the East came to an end because of the use of the atomic bomb. So I want to spend the last part of the recording discussing that. We knew we were about to win in the Pacific. We had already defeated the Germans in May of 1945 at VE Day, Victory in Europe, which was May 7th. We can now focus all of our attention on the Japanese. The Soviets had promised to help as well. Now that Germany was no longer a threat, the Italians had been defeated for a couple of years at this point. And with our island hopping strategy that we had used for the past 3 years, we were at Japan's doorstep, and we had consistently bombed the cities of Japan as well while we were island hopping and regaining those places in the Pacific. But the problem was we demanded unconditional surrender, which we knew the Japanese, despite all that they had faced in the previous 3 years of them being on the retreat, they were not going to surrender. That was a part of their code. They saw that as dishonor. So we were left in a dilemma. We could do a full-scale invasion of Japan. We knew we could be successful with that, but it would come at a very, very high cost. So this was a dilemma that Truman faced. Should he go in and do this and lose all these men, or could he end the war quickly with a terrible weapon that had just been finished testing, the atomic bomb? Another problem for Truman, which goes back to the issues that we had with the Soviets, we didn't trust the Soviets. Even though we were working with them to bring down Hitler in Europe, we didn't have the same ideology. We certainly didn't have the same type of government, and Truman didn't want to work with the Soviets with Japan, he didn't want them to have any type of advantage with occupying Japan later on after the war. So if he could involve the Soviets having to be involved with Japan in the fighting and just use the atomic bombs, then we wouldn't have to deal with the Soviets with Japan in the future. So these were some of the issues that influenced Harry Truman to use the atomic bomb on Japan, which brought the war in the East to a close. Finally, on this screen in the bottom of 159 and 160, you can see why we were successful.